December 14th, 1944. Deep in the Ardennes forest. The smell hit us first. Smoke, cedar wood, and something impossible. Roasted beef ribs. I had been captured only hours earlier, in a frozen forest near the Belgian border where my entire unit collapsed in less than an afternoon. Snow lay thick around my ankles, crisping under every hesitant step. Artillery still echoed somewhere far away. Low, distant booms that felt like the heartbeat of a dying continent. We were marched through shattered trees, past splintered trunks and foxholes half filled with ice. The air carried the sting of cordite, pine resin, and fear. I had prepared myself for humiliation. We all had. That was what we had been taught to expect from the Americans. But instead, I saw something else entirely. A group of American soldiers stood around a fire they had built for us, feeding it with chopped logs, warming the prisoners who could barely stand. One soldier knelt beside a girl who had fainted, lifting her gently and offering a canteen. Another pressed a steaming tin cup into the hands of a woman whose lips had turned blue. And then there was the cowboy. I swear, he looked as though he had walked straight out of one of our propaganda caricatures. Broad shoulders, leather gloves, a weathered jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. Only his expression didn't match the image we had been fed. He wasn't monstrous. He wasn't cruel. He smiled at me, warm, easy, almost shy, and reached out a steady hand to help me up from where I had stumbled. "Easy there, ma'am," he said in a slow Texas drawl, as if we were meeting on a quiet farm road and not in a war-torn forest littered with broken bodies and burning metal. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not from cold. Not from pain. But from confusion so sharp it nearly buckled my knees. Everything I had been taught about Americans, everything drilled into us in barracks, lectures, newspapers, began to unravel right there in that clearing among the trees. They were supposed to be savages. Brutes, a mongrel nation of criminals and cowards who would torture us the moment we fell into their hands. But instead, I watched them, building fires to warm prisoners, not threaten them, sharing water with those who could no longer walk, lifting us gently, as though we were something fragile rather than something hated. The contradiction gnawed at the edge of my understanding. Wrong, disorienting, almost frightening. Kindness, in a place like this, felt more dangerous than any weapon. If they had shouted, struck us, or dragged us by the hair, it would have matched the story we knew. But this unexpected mercy, it destabilized everything. As we were guided deeper into the woods, I noticed details that made the shock even sharper. Field kitchens, American ones, had been set up among the trees. Iron grates, heavy GI pots, fuel cans stacked neatly beside metal stoves. Everything efficient, organized, and absurdly abundant for a battlefield. And then the smell came again, thicker this time, drifting toward us through the trees like a forbidden memory. Roasted beef ribs, real meat, real fat, real fire, a luxury none of us had tasted in 5 long years. One of the women beside me gasped softly. Another began to cry without making a sound. I felt my stomach cramp with a longing so fierce it bordered on pain. Germany hadn't known abundance in years. Our families rationed every crumb. Our soldiers marched on empty stomachs. Women waited in bread lines stretching around blocks. In Berlin, mothers were trading wedding rings for a few slabs of margarine. Meanwhile, America, this country we had been told was weak, decadent, corrupt, was roasting meat in a winter forest on the eve of their largest European battle. A country that could fight a war and still smell like Sunday lunch, that was a country operating on a different scale of power. "We have more than enough," a guard said casually to another, not realizing I understood English. More than enough, even for our enemies. The words struck deeper than any threat. As we were herded closer to the clearing where the Americans had made camp, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the fire. Flames curled around iron grates. Snow hissed as it melted off the logs. and above it all the smell of ribs, pepper, smoke, fat, hung in the air like a ghost from a life I barely remembered. I found myself staring at the cowboy again. He wasn't watching us with suspicion. He wasn't gripping his rifle. He was stirring the fire, humming under his breath, as though feeding prisoners was simply another chore in a long day of honest work. It made no sense. None. And yet the warmth from the flame spread toward me, thawing the numb places in my fingers, my cheeks, my certainty. Something dangerous was happening. Dangerous not because it threatened my life, but because it threatened my understanding of the world. If the enemy was not what we had been told, if the Americans were generous even in the depths of war, if kindness could exist in a place as cold and brutal as the Ardennes, then what else had been a lie? The forest creaked in the wind. Snow drifted from the branches above, settling on my shoulders. The fire crackled. The ribs sizzled. And in that quiet, impossible moment, surrounded by the enemy who didn't look like enemies, I began to feel the first crack in a belief I had carried since girlhood, the crack that would one day split my entire world open. The closer we were led toward the American campfire, the heavier something grew inside my chest. It wasn't just hunger or exhaustion anymore. It was dread, the kind that rises slowly, tightening around the ribs until breathing feels like betrayal. What I had seen, the fire, the water, the smiles, felt wrong, too gentle, too contradictory, and nothing is more frightening to a prisoner than kindness that doesn't make sense. We had marched barely 10 steps from the clearing when the fear began to spread among us like frost creeping across glass. "Don't trust it," the woman behind me hissed. "They're softening us, making us let down our guard." Another muttered, "They torture prisoners after feeding them. Everyone knows this." A third whispered, her voice trembling, "Meat is the last meal before execution." And suddenly the smell that had stirred hope in me only minutes earlier now took on a sinister edge. Roasted beef. As bait, warm fire, to relax us? Water. To keep us alive just long enough for something worse? The propaganda had carved deep marks in us. We were taught that Americans enjoyed cruelty, that their camps were dungeons, that their guards were sadists, that surrender was the same as sentencing yourself to slow death. Stories spread through the ranks like infection. Soldiers skinned alive, women used in experiments, prisoners starved until they begged for bullets. None of us knew which stories were true. We only knew they were all we had. When another gust of wind carried the scent of beef fat toward us, one of the girls began to sob into her hands. "Stop crying," someone snapped at her. "That's what they want. They'll laugh when they see us beg." But she wasn't begging. None of us were. She was terrified because the smell, the impossible, heavenly smell, felt like a trick crafted precisely to break us. As we stepped into the clearing, my eyes landed on the first detail that made my stomach twist harder. A row of American aluminum canteens scattered on the snow, as if tossed aside casually by men who had so much that losing things meant nothing. One lay half-buried near my boot. I nudged it gently, and it rolled with a dull metallic clink, leaving a small trail in the frost. I felt a strange pang. Not envy, not yet, but a realization that these men lived in a world with more metal, more warmth, more everything than we could imagine. A world where a canteen could be misplaced, forgotten. In Germany, a soldier would guard such a thing with his life. Behind me, one of the POWs whispered, "They don't even need their equipment. Imagine how they treat their prisoners." I wasn't sure what she meant, but fear darkened her tone. Then a sharp, sputtering sound cracked through the clearing. We all flinched violently, some dropping to their knees, some covering their heads instinctively. I tasted iron in my mouth. My vision blurred. It took several seconds before I realized it wasn't gunfire. It was a Primus stove. One of the Americans had crouched beside it, striking the valve with a wrench and coaxing blue flame from the brass burner. The hiss, the flare, the metallic pop. each sound close enough to battlefield noise to send panic lancing through every one of us. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The GI repairing the stove noticed us staring. He looked confused for a moment, then offered a small wave, as if a wave could undo everything we had been taught. I tore my gaze away and stared at the ground. My breath fogged and vanished. The fear stayed. Then came the worst sound of all, a long, loud crackling, sizzling, sharp, violent, too close to the sound of bullets hitting wood or armor. Someone screamed and covered her ears. I ducked automatically, hands instinctively rising to shield myself. But it wasn't gunfire. It wasn't artillery. It was fat, dripping onto hot iron. American meat, thick, marbled, plentiful, spitting as flames licked along a rack of ribs. I swallowed hard, my throat constricting painfully. The sound, the smell, the warmth, they all blended into a haze of contradiction. My mind couldn't hold them at once. "How can they be cooking?" one woman whispered hoarsely. "Where do they even get this food?" "America has everything," another said bitterly. "Factories, farms, ships, they drown in abundance." It wasn't an exaggeration. Even I, raised on German pride and nationalist rhetoric, had heard rumors about the American economy. 96,000 aircraft produced in 1 year, food shipped by the millions of tons, entire Midwestern states raising more cattle than Germany could feed in a decade. Their soldiers came from ranches, farmlands, places where meat was not luxury, it was identity. They grew up around grills and smokehouses. They learned to season ribs before they learned to shoot rifles. They believed food was not just nourishment, but morality. Feed people first. Take care of your neighbor. Do the right thing because it's the right thing. None of these values existed in the world I had come from. Watching them now, laughing softly as they tended the fire, sharing stories while flipping ribs, glancing occasionally at us with something that looked suspiciously like concern, felt unreal. Wrong. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like farm boys doing a decent day's work. And maybe that was what frightened me most. Because cruelty is easy to accept. Cruelty matches the world we knew. But mercy is disorienting. I kept replaying the moment the cowboy lifted me from the snow and smiled. I had flinched when he touched me. Not because he hurt me, but because he didn't. The fear that now curled tight inside my chest wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of being wrong. Fear that the enemy I had been taught to hate might not be the monster I needed him to be. A girl beside me leaned close and whispered, her voice cracking. What if the stories were lies? What if they're better than us? I felt the question strike through me like a blade. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because deep down, beneath the hunger and exhaustion and cold, another thought had begun to bloom. Dangerous, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. If the Americans were truly our enemies, why did it feel like they were trying to save us? Fear still clung to us like the cold, sharp, biting, impossible to shake. Even as the Americans moved calmly around the clearing, tending their fire and equipment, my mind kept insisting that something was wrong. That no army would waste warmth or food on prisoners unless there was a darker purpose behind it. And then the forest shifted. The distant crunch of snow, steady, rhythmic, grew louder. Not boots. Ooves, I turned, heart tightening, expecting mounted patrols or perhaps the cavalry units our officers had claimed the Americans no longer used. Instead, emerging between the towering pines came a small formation of men, dressed in a way I had only ever seen on postcards or in childish storybooks. Cowboys, real ones. Wide-brimmed hats, leather chaps dusted with frost, rifles slung not aggressively but casually, in a manner only men who lived half their lives on horseback could manage. Their breath fogged in the cold as their horses snorted and pawed at the snow. For a moment, the entire group of POWs fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if stunned by the sudden intrusion of American mythology into a European battlefield. We had been taught that America was soulless, factories, machines, chaos, but these men looked like the country had stepped out of a dream and into the war. One of them dismounted with fluid ease and approached the fire, his boots crunching softly. He carried a coil of rope over his shoulder and the natural confidence of someone who spent his life working land, not taking it. His coat was lined with shearling, the cuffs worn smooth from years of use. The others followed, tying their horses to a broken tree branch, greeting the soldiers already present with warm thumps on the shoulder. The cowboy I recognized from earlier, the one who had lifted me up, approached us again. There was no hostility in his face, only a calm warmth that made the fear in my stomach twist into something more complicated. "You ladies look frozen," he said, kneeling next to a woman whose fingers had turned pale. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick wool coat, American military issue, heavy, clean, warm. He draped it over her shoulders without waiting for permission. Then another cowboy began handing out tin cups filled with steaming coffee. Coffee, not barley water or weak ersatz brew, but real coffee, rich and dark. When one was pressed into my hands, the heat stung my skin. I stared at the rising steam, unable to lift it to my lips. It made no sense, none at all. "We ain't gonna bite," the cowboy said with a half smile as if sensing my hesitation. "Drink before it gets cold." A few POWs accepted the cups slowly, cautiously. Others held them without drinking, unsure whether this was mercy or manipulation. Yet the Americans remained patient, unconcerned, going about their work with the quiet assurance of men who needed neither permission nor praise. Near the center of the clearing stood a potbelly, stove, squat and blackened from years of use. A soldier knelt beside it, opening the iron door to let the fire breathe. Sparks fluttered up like fireflies. He waved us closer. "Warm your hands here," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. It felt wrong to move forward, and yet my fingers burned with cold. I stepped closer, the heat licking gently at my knuckles. The simple act of warming myself beside a stove tended by the enemy made my throat tighten. It was too normal. Too human, too much like home. Then came another blow to everything I believed. The cowboys and soldiers gathered around the iron grate where the ribs were roasting. As one cowboy sprinkled coarse salt onto the meat, another cracked pepper in slow, practiced motions. They discussed the heat of the flame, whether to flip the ribs, whether the smoke was too strong. It was the kind of conversation my mother used to have with neighbors on Sundays. Casual, comfortable, familiar. The smell carried through the clearing again, and several women stiffened. My own stomach growled loudly enough that I flushed with embarrassment. One cowboy heard it. He glanced back at me, not mocking, not triumphant, but understanding. Then he did something that felt utterly impossible. He carved off a section of the ribs, steaming and glistening with fat, and placed it onto a metal plate. He didn't eat it. He didn't offer it to a fellow soldier. He turned, walked toward us, and held the plate out to me. My body went rigid. Several women gasped. One shook her head violently and backed away. "Go on," he said softly. "It's for you." My voice cracked as I managed. "Why? We are your enemies." He shrugged lightly as though the answer were obvious. "It's cold, ma'am. Nobody fights on an empty stomach." The words hit harder than any rifle butt could have, because in them lived the truth of America's strength. Not just its factories, not just its armies, not just its endless supply of food, but an ethos, a culture of abundance and decency so deep-rooted that even here, in the blood-soaked Ardennes, they would feed the people who had been sent to kill them. Behind him, the other Americans nodded, as though agreeing silently with what he'd said. The plate remained extended toward me, smoke curling gently from the meat. I could feel every POW around me watching, their breaths quick, uneven. Our officers had always told us Americans were weak, indulgent, lazy, morally bankrupt, but nothing about this moment felt weak. If anything, it felt like strength so vast it bordered on unfathomable. A soldier approached with another plate for the women next to me. "You eat first," he said. "We'll take ours after." That broke something inside me, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the first tremor of collapse. No army feeds its enemies before feeding its own. No nation spares its best food for those who surrendered. No victor shares warmth, clothing, and coffee freely. Yet America did, and they did it without ceremony, without lectures, without even expecting gratitude, just because it was the decent thing to do. I looked at the ribs again, thick, marbled, glistening with juices that stained the snow where they dripped. My hand trembled as I reached out. The warmth seeped into my fingertips and something inside my chest tightened painfully. This was kindness so unexpected it felt dangerous. As I held that plate, hot, heavy, unreal, I realized that the fear I had carried since my capture was beginning to shift. Not disappear, not yet, but transform into something stranger. A deep, unsettling awareness that the world might be far more complicated than the story I had been raised to believe. And somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper the question none of us dared ask aloud. What kind of nation treats its enemies like this? I didn't know the answer, but as the cowboy stepped back, giving me space, giving me dignity, I began to understand that whatever America was, whatever these men represented, it was something I had never been taught to imagine. I should have felt grateful. After years of hunger, deprivation, and the slow erosion of everything familiar, the warmth of the potbelly stove and the scent of roasted meat should have been a blessing. But as I stood there with the plate still warm in my trembling hands, gratitude was not what rose inside me. It was suspicion, thick, coiling, instinctive, born not of reason, but of the world I had come from. The others felt it too. I saw it in their faces, stiff as frozen bark, their eyes darting from the cowboys to the soldiers to the plates being handed out. Even as heat crept back into their fingers, even as steam curled beneath their noses, they held themselves rigid, as though every gesture of kindness were a tripwire waiting to snap. The woman to my left, Annalise, older than most of us, maybe 30, maybe younger but aged by war, shook her head violently as a soldier offered her a slice of rib. 9, she whispered, voice cracking. No one gives prisoners meat, unless they want something worse. Her words struck several of the others like a slap. I watched 3 women immediately lower their plates, their shoulders tightening as though bracing for an invisible blow. A few stepped back, clutching the coats and coffee they'd been given as if they might be poisoned through fabric alone. Even I hesitated. The plate felt heavy, foreign. My eyes stung with warmth and confusion. Behind us, a girl hissed under her breath. They're breaking us down, making us trust them. Another added, it's psychological warfare. They want us to forget who we are. And the most chilling whisper of all came from a woman whose voice trembled as if centuries of fear lived inside her. They're tai no chung ta, brainwashing us. I swallowed hard. Was that what this was? Kindness as manipulation? Food as a weapon? It didn't seem possible. And yet everything we had been taught told us that nothing the Americans did could be taken at face value. We had been fed too many stories, too many horrors, too many warnings about smiling enemies and poisoned generosity. But slowly, quietly, the cracks began to form in those beliefs. Because no matter how deeply the propaganda had shaped us, even fear must eventually yield to hunger. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of charred fat and pepper, so rich it made my stomach twist painfully. The plate in my hands shook. I tightened my grip, wishing desperately that my own body wouldn't betray me in front of the others. I glanced at the American soldiers. They weren't watching us with malice. They weren't smirking or whispering or exchanging triumphant glances. They simply tended the fire, flipped the ribs, refilled tin cups, and nudged logs into place with boots dusted in snow, like men doing an honest day's work on a cold winter morning, not men orchestrating a trap. Still, the fear clung to us. It had shaped us for too long to loosen easily. Back home in Germany, if home still existed, people were starving. Real starvation. The kind that hollowed the cheeks of children and left old men collapsing in the street. Rations had been cut again and again. 300 grams of bread per day. Meat allowances shrinking to scraps. Most families survived on potatoes, turnips, and the hope that tomorrow's air raid might spare their kitchen. I had heard rumors that by late 1944, some German households received barely 200 grams of meat per month, if they received any at all. And yet here, in a muddy forest half a world away, American soldiers were giving us ribs thick with fat and flavor. Not crumbs, not scraps, not leftovers scraped from their own plates. Fresh, plentiful meat. It didn't fit into any version of the world we understood. I remembered overhearing one of our officers months earlier before our unit collapsed. "Americans eat like kings," he had spat. "They have so much they can afford to throw it away." At the time, I thought it was an exaggeration meant to steal our resolve, but now, I wasn't sure, because this field kitchen, this abundance, this casual generosity, did not feel like excess. It felt like culture, like identity. Later, I would learn that America fed its POWs 3,200 calories a day in strict compliance with the Geneva Convention, more food than many German civilians saw in a week. Even their prisoners were treated with a degree of humanity that our own army rarely afforded its soldiers. But standing there, in that moment, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that the Americans' abundance terrified me almost as much as their kindness. A cowboy refilled my tin cup with coffee, offering a gentle nod before stepping away. I stared at the dark liquid. Why give it to me? Why warm us? Why share their best food in the midst of a war they were still fighting? From behind me came another voice, sharp with panic. "It's a trick. They're softening us before interrogation." Another added, "They want us to like them, to betray our country." But then Annalise, the same older woman who had warned us moments earlier, whispered something new, something frail, something almost childlike in its uncertainty. Or, what if they simply do this because it is who they are? Her question hung in the cold air. I felt my heart falter, because even though fear still rooted itself deep inside me, part of me knew she might be right. These Americans, cowboys and farm boys and mechanics, did not look like the villains printed on our propaganda posters. They did not treat us like trophies. They treated us like people. People who were cold and hungry, people who needed coats and fire and warm drinks, people worth feeding. I looked again at the cowboy who had given me the ribs. He stood beside the fire flipping another rack, humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby carried by the wind across an ocean. His breath curled in soft clouds. His shoulders relaxed. There was no hatred in his movements, not even contempt. Just an easy confidence that came from belonging to a country so wealthy, so stable, so secure in its moral code that showing mercy cost them nothing. And that realization frightened me far more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty is simple, predictable, logical. Mercy is something else entirely, something disarming, destabilizing, something that forces you to question everything. I felt the first bite of meat on my tongue. The warmth spread through me like a shock. It was tender, rich, overwhelming. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, not from joy, but from the violent clash between the world I had been promised and the one I was standing in. Around me, the other women hesitated, wavered, then slowly, one by one, lifted their own plates. Hunger outran ideology. Cold outran fear. And humanity, quiet, stubborn, undeniable, began to seep into the cracks. I heard one POW whisper under her breath as though confessing to a sin. Perhaps the Americans are not monsters. Another answered, no, They are something much more dangerous. What? Someone whispered. Good. And in that moment, cold forest, warm stove, the smell of ribs drifting upward through the trees, I understood why this frightened us so deeply. Because if the Americans were good, then we had been wrong. If they were generous, then we had been misled. If they were merciful, then our hatred had no foundation at all. And if that was true, then everything we believed about the world, about the war, about ourselves, was beginning to crumble. For a long moment after Annalise whispered that single dangerous word, good, the clearing fell into a strange, trembling silence. Not peaceful, not calm, but fragile, like a thin sheet of ice stretched across deep water. One wrong step, one wrong thought, and it felt as though everything inside me would shatter. The plate in my hands had cooled slightly, though steam still curled lazily from the ribs. Around me, the other women stood stiff, uncertain, torn between fear and need. The Americans kept tending the fire, unbothered, their breath rising in white strands as ribs sizzled and fat dripped onto glowing coals. Their ease, their absolute lack of menace, only deepened the conflict inside my chest. I had fought hunger for years, but I had never fought hope. Hope was far more dangerous. Finally, with fingers trembling from cold and something deeper, I lifted the first piece of meat to my lips. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The moment my teeth broke through the surface, warm fat spilled into my mouth like nothing I had tasted since girlhood. Salt, smoke, the deep richness of real beef, flavors so familiar yet so distant, they felt like ghosts brushing against the back of my throat. My jaw froze. My breath caught. And then something inside me cracked. It wasn't just taste, it was memory. I was suddenly 8 years old again, standing barefoot on the stone floor of my mother's kitchen. My father carving the Sunday roast. My mother leaning over the stove, humming. Light filtering through lace curtains. Warmth. Safety. A world before sirens, before ration cards, before bomb craters swallowed neighborhoods whole. A world that no longer existed. The contrast was too much, too sharp, too cruel. My knees buckled. I pressed a hand to the snow, gripping the earth to keep myself from collapsing entirely. But the grief came anyway. Hot, violent, unexpected. Tears blurred my vision. My throat closed. My body shook under the weight of too many years, too many losses, too many empty plates and unanswered prayers. The rib slipped from my fingers and fell into the snow. I didn't care. I bowed my head and sobbed. Not graceful tears, not quiet ones. Raw, choking, uncontrollable sobs that tore out of me with years of hunger and fear tangled inside them. Around me, other women began breaking too. One fell forward, catching herself on her hands as she cried into the snow. Another clutched her piece of meat to her chest as though afraid someone might take it away. A third took a bite, then another, each chew accompanied by fresh tears as she whispered her children's names under her breath. Mein Sohn. Mein kleines Mädchen. She wept louder. Why them? Why do they starve while I eat this here? The forest echoed with grief. Quiet at first, then swelling into a chorus of broken voices muffled by frost and wool scarves. It was the kind of crying that came not from the moment, but from everything that came before it. Years of fear, sacrifice, indoctrination, deprivation, and guilt. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve, but the tears wouldn't stop. They streamed hot against my freezing skin, dripping into the snow in small, dark spots. Why was this happening? Why was I unraveling over a piece of meat? Because kindness can hurt more than cruelty. Because mercy can expose wounds you never knew you carried. And because tasting something beautiful in the midst of devastation forces you to confront everything the war stole from you. I didn't realize the cowboy had approached until a shadow fell across me. He crouched down slowly, careful, gentle, as if approaching a frightened animal. His gloved hands rested on his knees. His eyes, soft beneath the brim of his hat, searched my face not with suspicion, but with concern. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "did it hurt you?" His voice wavered with confusion. Not understanding. Not yet. I shook my head, pressing a hand to my mouth as another sob hit me like a wave. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers stepped closer, brow furrowed in honest bewilderment as he watched another woman sink to her knees. "Why are they crying?" he whispered to the cowboy. The cowboy exhaled, a slow, heavy breath as though the weight of something unspoken finally settled on him. "We just wanted to help, that's all." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no justification, just a quiet sadness that cut deeper than any accusation. He didn't understand that kindness, when given to someone who has forgotten what it feels like, can break them apart. He didn't know that meat wasn't just food to us, it was memory, guilt, longing, loss. He didn't know that the sudden abundance in our hands made us painfully aware of the emptiness everywhere else. The soldier beside him shifted awkwardly. "Should we stop serving them?" The cowboy shook his head firmly. "No, they need this, even if it's hard." Even if it hurts, I thought. Another wave of tears came, this one softer, more human. I forced myself to look at him. His breath hung in the cold, his cheeks reddened by wind, his eyes kind in a way that felt dangerous because kindness has the power to change a person. "I'm sorry," I finally managed to whisper. "You don't need to be sorry," he replied. "You're hungry. You're tired. Anyone would cry." But he didn't understand. My tears weren't just hunger. They were the unraveling of a lie. They were the beginning of knowing the enemy was human. Behind me, another POW finally gathered the courage to take her first bite. She gasped at the taste, then collapsed into her hands, sobbing until her shoulders shook violently. Another woman leaned against a tree, chewing in tiny, reverent motions while tears streamed silently down her neck. One of the Americans stepped closer to her, confused and helpless. "Ma'am, did we do something wrong?" She shook her head, unable to speak, clutching the rib as though it were the last fragile piece of her identity she still controlled. "It's their first real meal in years," the cowboy murmured to the others. "War ain't fair. They lost more than battles." I looked at him again, truly looked, and something inside me shifted, not enough to be called trust, not enough to be called understanding, but enough to feel the first stirrings of something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time: recognition. That we were not so different. He rose slowly, giving me space, giving me dignity, and as he stepped back toward the fire, the world around me blurred again. Heat, snow, smoke, tears, all swirling together as though the forest itself mourned with us. And in that moment I understood something terrifying. Cruelty had never broken me. Hunger had never broken me. Loss had scarred me but left me standing. But mercy, unexpected, undeserved, overwhelming, that was what shattered me. The sobs eventually quieted, not because the grief had passed, but because exhaustion had wrapped itself around us like another layer of snow. One by one, the women wiped their faces, steadied their breathing, and began to eat again, slowly, reverently, as though each bite were a fragile relic that might crack under too much pressure. I lifted the rib from the snow, brushed off the frost, and held it between my shaking fingers. It looked different now. Still food, still warmth, still survival, but also something symbolic, something larger than itself. A message carved not in words, but in generosity. The cowboy who had spoken to me earlier returned to the fire, flipping the next rack with casual, practiced ease. The Americans resumed their quiet chatter. Nothing about them suggested triumph or condescension. They hadn't gloated when we cried, hadn't mocked us for weakness, hadn't even acted as though they'd done anything extraordinary. And maybe for them, they hadn't. That realization unsettled me more deeply than any weapon could have. I took another bite of the rib. The warmth spread through my chest, loosening something inside me that had been knotted for years. As the taste settled on my tongue, I felt a shift, a slow, seismic shift, like the cracking of ice beneath a dawn sun. It wasn't just the meat. It wasn't just the fire or the coats or the coffee. It was the unmistakable truth forming inside me, clear and cold as the winter air. Germany had not lost because we were weaker. We had lost because they were stronger in ways we never understood. Not just stronger in steel or numbers, stronger in spirit, stronger in abundance, stronger in the belief that even war could not strip them of decency. I closed my eyes, feeling the last tears slip free, and let that truth settle inside me with a weight I had never carried before. For years, we had been told that sacrifice was noble, that hunger proved loyalty, that our suffering was proof of moral superiority. We were taught to believe scarcity was a virtue, that pain was discipline, that obedience defined greatness. But standing there, cheeks wet, ribs in hand, my stomach full, for the first time in months, I understood that none of those beliefs fed a nation, literally or figuratively. America fed its people, fed its soldiers, fed its prisoners. Not because they were soft, not because they were naive, but because they could. A soldier passed by carrying a bucket of water to refill the stove. He noticed me watching him and paused, resting the bucket on the ground. "You feelin' better, ma'am?" he asked gently. I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated, then offered a small, thoughtful smile. "You know," he said, adjusting his gloves, "we don't win wars by starving people." He shrugged lightly as if stating an obvious truth. "We win by being who we are." I blinked at him, stunned by the simplicity of the statement. Being who we are. Those 4 words struck me harder than artillery. They carried the weight of an entire nation's identity. Humble, assured, unwavering in its values. A country that believed its morality didn't need to bend to win. I looked around the clearing. The Americans worked with quiet efficiency, tending the fire, helping prisoners stand, distributing blankets, pouring coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There was no cruelty in them, no smugness, only a steady confidence that came from understanding their place in the world. It was the opposite of everything I had been raised on. Germany. Obedience. Sacrifice. Hardship. Ideology. Propaganda. Masquerading as honor. America. Abundance. Practicality. Humanity. Confidence without arrogance. Kindness without weakness. The contrast was so stark it made my heart ache. A woman near the edge of the clearing swallowed a mouthful of meat and whispered to herself, "They have so much, they can give it away." Another POW murmured, "In Germany, mothers cry for a bone to boil." A third said bitterly, "They feed their..." laughed again in streets that were once rubble. Factories hummed, markets filled, life returned. But hunger, grief, war, those leave marks that even prosperity cannot fully erase. When I returned home in 1946, I stepped into a country nearly unrecognizable. Buildings flattened, families broken, a nation hollowed out from the inside, pride burned away, illusions collapsed, the old certainty shattered beyond repair. Many of us came home wondering who we were without the slogans, without the flags, without the promises that had led us to ruin. Yet through all the devastation, I carried one memory that glowed like a stubborn ember refusing to die. A fire in a forest, a cowboy's gentle smile, a plate of beef ribs warm in my frozen hands, and the quiet conviction in an American soldier's voice, "We win by being who we are." That moment, simple, human, impossibly generous, became the compass of my life. For years I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. How could a single act of kindness in the middle of a brutal winter change everything I believed? How could meat, of all things, carry such weight? How could mercy break me more deeply than hunger ever had? But when I had my first child, then my second, the answer finally came. When they asked me about the war, as children always do, curious about the darkness behind the photographs, I told them only one story. Not about battles, not about fear. not about defeat, but about the night an American handed me food before he fed himself. The night he placed a plate into the hands of someone taught to hate him. The night he looked at a frightened girl from the other side of the world and saw, not an enemy, not a threat, but a human being worth keeping warm. That, I told my children, is the greatest power any nation can wield. Longhan Jiao, humanity, the courage to be kind. I wanted them to understand something deeper than politics, deeper than borders, deeper than the fragile ideologies that rise and fall with time. Strength means nothing without mercy. Victory means nothing without decency. And the greatest nations are built not only on power, but on compassion. Even now, decades later, I can still smell the cedar smoke, still hear the crackle of fat dripping onto the flames, still feel the wool coat an American draped over my shoulders. These memories have become part of my bones, inseparable from the person I became. And sometimes, when the world feels heavy again, when division grows, when people forget the lessons carved by history, I think of that cowboy wiping snow off his hat, looking at a group of terrified German girls and saying softly, "We just wanted to help, that's all." It has taken a lifetime to find the right words, but here they are. You did not defeat me with bullets. You defeated me with beef ribs, with a warm coat, with a hand extended instead of a fist, with the impossible mercy of feeding me before I believed I deserved to live. That is how you won. Not just the war, but the argument about what kind of world human beings should strive to build. I have lived long enough to see many countries rise and fall, lose their way and try to find it again. But I have never forgotten the America I met in that forest. Strong, yes, and wealthy beyond imagination, but more importantly, confident enough in its values to show humanity even to its enemies. There is a kind of greatness in that which defies time. And to those Americans who listen to stories like mine today, your fathers and grandfathers were not only warriors, they were moral giants who believed that decency was prisoners better than our government feeds its citizens. No one argued, because it was true, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. I stared at the soldiers, boys really, laughing softly, nudging each other, brushing snow off their sleeves. Maybe they didn't understand the revolution they were causing in our minds. Maybe they didn't realize generosity, when shown to an enemy, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. Not a weapon of war, a weapon of clarity, one that forced us to reckon with the collapse of our world view. As I ate the last bite of meat, warmth seeped through me. Physical, yes, but more than that. It was a warmth that reached backward into memories of home, into the girl I once was, into the simple humanity I had learned to bury beneath uniforms and slogans. A warmth that thawed something long frozen. I began to understand, truly understand, that the Americans weren't trying to conquer us as individuals. They were trying to win the war by proving something larger than military power. They were proving that strength came from generosity, not control. That decency was not weakness but strategy. That abundance, shared freely, was a message in itself. A message that said, "We don't fear you, we don't hate you, we don't need to crush you to win. We will win because our way of life is stronger than your ideology." And they were right. A quiet stillness settled over me. A clarity so sharp it felt like standing on a mountaintop. I inhaled the scent of cedar smoke and charred beef, letting it fill my lungs, letting it mark the moment I began to understand the truth. America's power was not just its factories, its cattle, or its weapons. It was its values, practical, generous, deeply human. Values that didn't crumble under war. I wondered, just briefly, what would become of Germany if it had chosen humanity over hardness. What my life would have been if my country had fed its people instead of feeding its pride. What we could have been if we had done what this cowboy had done so effortlessly. Extend kindness even when victory seemed certain. I looked again at the American soldier's face. The ease, the sincerity, the steadiness, and a painful admiration crept into my chest. We win by being who we are. What a simple sentence. What a terrifying truth. A truth that made me understand, for the first time, that war had already been lost long before I stepped onto this battlefield. Not because Germany lacked courage or discipline, but because we lacked the very thing that burned in this clearing like a second fire: humanity. And as I swallowed the last of the ribs, tears drying on my cheeks, a question rose quietly inside me. Soft, trembling, impossible to ignore. If this is who the Americans are, what does that make us? Long after the ribs were gone and the fire had burned down to embers, I lay awake beneath an American wool blanket, staring at the silhouettes of trees against the winter night. Sleep didn't come. Not because of fear. Fear had shaped so many of my nights already, but because something new had taken root inside me. A quiet certainty, a painful, humbling truth, and a question that echoed like wind through the pines. If this is who the Americans are, what does that make us? I didn't know the answer then, but I would spend the rest of my life learning it. I am an old woman now. My hands have wrinkled, my hair turned silver, and the world I once knew, the world of uniforms, sirens, and winter marches, has long since slipped into history books. Germany rebuilt itself from ash. Children, not a weakness, but a duty. That is why America was great. That is why America mattered. Not because of the weapons it built, but because of the humanity it refused to abandon. If you are an American reading or hearing this, I hope you feel what I felt on that night. Because your country once showed the world a standard of mercy few nations have ever matched. Because there was a time, clear, steady, unshakable, when America knew exactly who it was. Generous, united, principled. Because you will wonder, as I often do, does America still remember the spirit of its greatest generation? And finally, deep, enduring gratitude from those like me, German POWs who survived because your soldiers chose compassion over cruelty. I survived the war. I built a family. I lived a long life. And all of it, every breath beyond that winter, was shaped by a simple truth I learned from a cowboy with a warm fire and a plate of ribs. Humanity is the greatest strength of all.